Headcruscher. Time was passing by, and he still could not find a way to get noticed. His aim was out of reach, but what could he do, sitting in an empty corridor, at the mercy of a hysterical nurse who sat there giggling to herself? "I know," he thought to himself, and began singing the chorus of a rock anthem really loud and badly off-key. He could not remember the words, so he started humming in rhythm, which unfortunately sounded more like someone trying to do a number 2. That wouldn't work, so he tried his best and leant over the girl and touched her chest. At that moment, they heard noise come from the room, as if someone or something was banging on the walls. 2 men in gray uniforms came running down the corridor towards Chester, who froze, imagining they had witnessed his behavior and intended to beat him up. They arrived out of breath and turned their backs to him, kicking his wheelchair as they did. Ora, on the other hand, didn't even flinch and carried on admiring her hands. The 2 imposing, round-gutted guards swung into the room one after the other. Chester could not believe his eyes. A tall, built, silver-haired man in jeans and tight, bright red T-shirt sat on the back of a young man on the floor, blocking his hands behind his head in an attempt to rip a sharp paper cutter out of them. The guards held the young man down by putting their feet on his buttocks and courteously asked the doctor to let go of the man, as they would take over from there, and so it was. They lifted the man up by the armpits and dragged him all the way to the lift, which was ready for them with open doors. There was a 3rd guard inside the lift, but all Chester saw of him was a thick and hairy arm which reached out to grab the hair of the young man who was still struggling and spitting at the air, and dragged him into the lift slowly and with no effort at all, the way a spider deals with a misfortunate prey stuck on its web. He heard the young man scream in pain as the doors of the lift closed. Chester was suddenly covered by a shadow and scared to death found the doctor standing with his hands on his hips, right in front of him. He was particularly focused and irritated by the position of Chester's hand, which he immediately retrieved and slapped on its back, shouting, "Naughty, naughty hand!" The doctor was not amused, and with a gesture of his index finger beckoned him into his office. Ora stood up laughing and kissed the doctor on the cheek, very close to his mouth, to which he responded with a grin of approval, but without losing composure. The girl pushed the wheelchair slowly up to a large desk made of light, shiny wood and then sat on a comfortable bright yellow armchair next to Chester. Everything in the room was the color of lemons, walls, curtains, chairs, and the biker's jacket on the coat hanger by the door. It was so bright in there that it hurt his eyes, as if he was sitting inside a light bulb. The doctor did not sit straight away, but stood behind his patient and stretched for a while, bending down to touch the toes of his yellow biker boots, then to his right and then left, stretched upwards and rotated his head to stretch his neck muscles. Chester wanted to come across as crazy, but he felt like the only sane person there. He quietly asked Ora, "Where have you taken me?" "This guy is insane." She did not answer and turned her back to him, as if offended by his remark. After his exercises, patting his patient on the shoulder with a big and strong hand, the man walked over to his chair and sat down, opening a thick folder and turned the pages, all the while staring into Ora's eyes, saying, "Darling, take a break. Remember the suit is at the dry cleaner's. We'll go dancing tonight." Chester was confused. First that kiss almost on the mouth, then he called her darling, then he asked her out. He concluded that they must be having an affair, which was the sole explanation, as the doctor wore a wedding ring and looked about 30 years her senior. Chester assumed that he must have used his psychic powers to seduce her. He was sad and angry at the thought that such a pretty and joyous girl should find herself in a relationship with that old man. Yes, he did seem to take care of himself and work out, and certainly his job must have meant he was pretty minted, but none of that hid the fact that he had been through the wars. Chester turned to the girl, feeling sorry for her poor choice, considering the man was also married. He then turned to the doctor in disgust. Ora stood up blowing a loud kiss which echoed in the room and said, "Thank you. See you later, Daddy." Unable to swallow, Chester perceived that the doctor had understood his thoughts, and he had no idea how to escape that embarrassing and potentially dangerous situation. He knew he deserved a slap, but that hand was so huge that it would certainly have cost him a few teeth. He hurried to prevent such a situation with a charming smile, as he politely said, "You know, doctor, I have just had heart surgery. They say that the slightest bit of stress could kill me, you know." The doctor lifted his eyes from the folder, laughing and banging a hand on the table hard enough to cause Chester and his wheelchair to bounce an inch into the air. He was so frightened that he had to try very hard not to piss himself again. "I am glad to see that your legs, arms, and heart are functioning very well," said the doctor, adding, "I'm Dr. Argo, but you can call me Headcruscher, if you prefer." Chester instantly decided to stick with Argo, and with a resigned and polite tone he asked, "Why am I here?" Argo explained that the police had found strange belongings in his flat and suspected he might be planning an explosion, but that if he told him all the truth, one session should have sufficed, rather than the full course of 12. He could have been out of hospital in a few days too, as he was recovering very well, physically. He pointed out that he needed to collaborative, to relax and just spill the beans, otherwise he would have seen a similar treatment to the previous patient. Chester had no intention of lying, totally discarding the plan to pass for a madman. There was no way he could fool a man like that. A hole on the wall to his right seemed to have been caused by the head of the young man that had been carried away by the security guards, and Chester wondered if the young man had bashed his head against that wall himself due to madness, or whether he was shoved into the wall head first by another force. Certainly, the nickname favored by the doctor was not reassuring. One thing was sure. Chester had no intention of getting beaten up, and, most of all, he wanted out of that hospital and out of that yellow room. That color and the light it reflected made him feel uncomfortable, as if it could penetrate his very mind and make his thoughts visible to the outer world. It made him feel helpless, naked. The large plasters that covered his bandages tugged at his skin, causing his stitches to sting sharply, so he tried to get comfortable, to relax, taking long, deep breaths. He now felt he was the right guy in the right place, and felt an overwhelming desire to open up and release all that anger and stress that had built up over the recent weeks. All his fears, all those uncertainties. He no longer knew what was going on in his life. He felt like a log in a river, knocked about by rapids. He could see no support, no anchor to steady him. All seemed vain, useless, and perhaps talking and confiding in someone who seemed so clever might have been useful. Perhaps he could have been of help. He could have provided him with the correct tools to find the right course of action and provide some reassurance within that mental vortex of delusions and misunderstandings. Argo needed to say nothing more. He understood that the young man before him was like a balloon full of air just waiting to burst, and, in fact, within a few moments the balloon did. Chester proceeded to tell his unbelievably dramatic story. He hadn't confided in anybody in months, perhaps years, and a stranger was exactly what he had been looking for. That doctor intent on crossing boxes was ideal. He was an outsider who could listen to him without judging him or thinking him crazy, which of course was his intention up to just a few seconds earlier, to be certified insane. Of course, it was nothing like talking to a friend. But Chester had no real friends, due to his introvert nature and to his wife's disapproval of his making new acquaintances. He poured out all of his frustration and anger. He talked freely. After all, he had nothing to hide, if not the shame and embarrassment of having become useless over the years, to himself and to society. His first concern was to clear up the matter of the objects found in his apartment, as he wanted to be at ease with the law. He started off by saying that he was fired the previous month. He was manager of a powerful company owned by his father-in-law, which contracted jobs for the army. He was forced to leave with not even a change of underwear. Even when visiting his mother-in-law for support, he found her brandishing a knife which she intended to dirty with his blood. The misunderstanding began when he stopped his car in the pouring rain to help a girl he had seen fall off her bicycle and hurt her knees. It had happened right in front of him, so he had to help. She was lying in pain on the road, under the torrential rain which was quickly turning to hailstones. The girl had lost control of her bike whilst rushing to get home and had fallen onto the road, her legs covered in mud. Chester helped her by offering her a lift in his car, and only after she cleaned her face whilst heartily thanking him did he recognize her. She was his ex-fiancée. At that moment, sitting in his SUV by the edge of the road, with the 4 indicators ticking away, he froze, speechless. He felt guilt. He had dumped her in the worst way possible, by leaving her standing at the altar on their wedding day. He was so embarrassed, his face growing crimson as he lost all ability to move. Only after a few long moments of silence she smiled, hugging him and breaking the tension in that space. They both laughed heartily without any real reason. Well, perhaps the reason of breaking the ice after that unexpected encounter, after so many years apart. She hadn't expected to run into him either, having lost all contact with him after he had stood her up in front of the priest and with over 200 guests behind her. She had waited for hours. Thanks to him, she had learnt the true meaning of sadness and disappointment. The event had brought so much stress to her that she sought psychiatric as well as nutritional help, as she tried to kill herself by not eating for the 2 years that followed. They had been the 24 longest months of her life. Unable to escape that syndrome caused by abandonment, she was forced by her family to spend the early days in hospital, to be watched by expert personnel in case she should attempt suicide. The following minutes neither of them mentioned the past. They simply drove to a café in search of warmth and shelter. Unfortunately, the place was packed and the only free table was in a secluded corner of the restaurant, sheltered by some fake plants. It had just been cleared by a couple of girls who walked away laughing loudly, leaving behind a bunch of flowers on the table. Chester had no idea why a group of girls stared at him from behind a bunch of large menus, but ignored them and focused his attention upon the huge bunch of red roses, so beautiful and undoubtedly expensive, left behind by the 2 friends. Destiny often throws nasty surprises, and Chester's was that a friend of his ex-wife was present and ready to report what was happening to her. Unfortunately, she did not stop at the truth and embellished the story somewhat, telling his ex-wife of what was obviously an ongoing affair, that she had seen them meet together for months, same time, same place, and holding each other's hand whilst lovingly gazing into each other's eyes. She said that at every secret meeting, he presented her with a new and expensive present. All this was not merely reported in person either, but publicly shared across her social network page, together with a picture taken on her cell phone of the 2 lovers and 24 red roses, which proved it all to be true. After dropping off his ex, Chester got home, hung his coat and started to dial the number to report that a car was parked outside with a door open, which might have suggested that it was stolen. He was then offered a great coffee, which was swiftly followed by flying cups, sugar pot and spoon, at which point his body became the target of all manners of kitchen utensils. He was so stunned by what was happening that he could not react. Unsure of whether he should ask for an explanation as to why his wife may be so angry with him, or rush to hospital to get some stitches on the deep cut on his forehead, caused by the crystal angel, the one which weighed a couple of kilos and he used as a paperweight on the side table they kept on the first-floor landing, which came shooting at his head at the speed of a bullet. He reckoned that talking would be out of the question, as his missus was now on the ground floor and was walking to the glass cabinet, which contained most of their wedding presents made of crystal or china. It was practically an arsenal of ammunitions. The only viable decision was to run away. He stumbled out of the building and found shelter in his car, thinking he would seek an explanation from his mother-in-law, who had always treated him like a son. But no need to go anywhere, for she was right behind him, ready to stab him in the gut. He got into the car and locked himself in, driving off in so much confusion that he did not even turn on the windscreen wipers, not realizing that the rain was stronger than ever. He reversed at high speed through the gates, then stepped on the brake hard, stopping the huge vehicle. He could not see anything. He guessed his way around as the blood from the cut at his forehead trickled into his eyes. He wiped his eyes with his hand, then with his arm, but that only made things worse, and between rain and blood his eyes were veiled. He could not stay there. He knew his wife kept a gun inside a little safe by her bedside table, and, by the way she had welcomed him home, he feared that she might use it on him. He was so scared at that thought that he stepped on the accelerator all the way. The acceleration was so powerful that he drove the 500 meters up to the main road in a second, but he got no farther. Turning into the motorway at high speed, he ran straight into the highway patrol. He was rushed first to A&E, then taken to spend the rest of the night at the police station. He had got away lightly, as he was on a large and heavy vehicle, with the worst damage being the facial trauma caused by the airbag going off. The night guards had not been so lucky, especially the officer in the passenger seat, who had seen 2 blinding headlights ram into and beyond the side of the car. The poor man had no bone left whole in his body. Fortunately, doctors predicted a positive recovery, saying that after 6 months of rest he would be as good as new. Chester was rather worried, as he felt deeply sorry about the damage he had caused. Argo had stopped fiddling with his papers, understanding that the lad had been through a rough time, so he listened carefully and encouraged him to speak farther, and then Chester had passed Ariel the roses just so she could put them on the chair behind her, and he had only taken her hand into his to remove a splinter which had stuck itself into it when she had fallen off her bike. It had only been a terrible misunderstanding, but he was never able to clear it up with anyone. That night at the police station he had only slept a couple of uncomfortable hours while sitting on a hard chair, only to have been released after signing interminable amounts of forms, just in time to get to work, dirty, unshaven, smelling of dry sweat. But at work he had found another nasty surprise. At the entrance of that immense glass building belonging to his father-in-law, the receptionist met him with a letter of dismissal, which was to take immediate effect. He was soon attacked by the security guards, who forced him to hand in his house keys by searching him and taking them straight out of his pocket. That morning was going from bad to worse, when a few hours later his credit card was refused. Argo got comfortable, put his feet on the desk and stretched out his legs, rather enjoying the story. He seemed genuinely interested, especially when Chester spoke of Ariel and of his father-in-law. He wondered that perhaps he had a similar experience in his youth, and, clearing his throat, he asked, "But what has this all got to do with the acid and tools found in your apartment by the police?" Chester made a gesture with his hand to signal that he would get there soon, but he needed a drink first. His mouth was dry, but he was getting there. He had suddenly lost his wife, his car, his home, and his money, which were replaced with a letter of dismissal, a demand of payment for moral damages by the company, and a fine by the police with the date of a court hearing to attend, where he could explain why he had destroyed a police car. He had lost a tooth and had received 10 stitches on his forehead. In technical terms, he had found himself with his arse on the street. He had absolutely needed to find a job. He was broke, but his father-in-law, a rich and powerful businessman with fingers in many pies and many powerful friends, had burned the ground all around him, making it impossible for anyone to offer him a job, in spite of his great managerial skills and talents as chemical scientist. Someone had even made it impossible for him to visit his offices. Someone else had him thrown out like a sack of potatoes. So he had decided to invest what little money he had left on the cheap rental of a tiny and moldy little flat. He still needed to find work, but realized that he had to rely on his own skills, and his first thought was that he could extract gold from electrical components, which he did. He started as soon as he had moved into his new home, searching in bins for old computers and any other type of electrical equipment. He found some overalls in the closet which, other than some black patches on the ceiling, had escaped the mold. There was also a box of tools he could use. He was frightened and ashamed of his situation, and, not wishing to be recognized by anyone, he covered his head with a hat and blackened his face with some grease from an old half-open tin he had found. He would have been very hard to recognize like that. He was confused, wondering why his wife had chased him away in such a violent manner, why his credit cards were not accepted, but most of all he wondered how he could have fallen so low. Just the day before he had been sitting in his comfortable office, with a mini-fridge full of drinks and chocolates, his comfy leather office chair, waiting for his usual hot cup of latte to be delivered. The next day he was rummaging the bins with his hands, covered in grease and wounded both in body and soul. In the closet he also found a school bag, which might have belonged to a nephew of the landlord, ideal for carrying tools. By the bins he had found 2 dismantled appliances, an old washing machine, and a fridge. He promptly hid behind them to shelter himself from the unwanted attention of passers-by and proceeded to dismantle the motors, their connectors, and any other gold-plated parts. After 30 minutes of intense labor, he extracted the final piece. But that was not enough. He needed more, so he stood up, lowering the visor of his hat, and went to open the fridge. That action suddenly made him feel very hungry, as his recent diet had been rather strict. His luck seemed to turn, as inside the fridge were dozens of old cell phones, packed on every shelf and compartment. He immediately took the rucksack off his back and filled it with that fortuitous treasure. He was almost satisfied of his work, in spite of how tired and sweaty he was. He was not used to manual labor, especially not using spanners, wrenches, and pliers, and he had covered his hands in cuts and blood. He had not been planning things very well and had just been following his instinct under the pressure he felt, fearing he would soon run out of food. He had lived through a similar situation as a child, before he had been welcomed into the orphanage. He had lost all recollection of where he came from or of his family. He was told that he had been found by a woodcutter in a forest, far out of town, feeding himself grass and in a state of shock caused by obvious starvation. Those sad memories tore all strength from him, and he felt the need to hide in an alley, far from prying eyes. He thought about many things, not least that he needed to speak to Diana and demand an immediate explanation. He returned home with the phones noisily clattering inside his rucksack. He dropped the bag on the floor and went straight back out, ran down the stairs, and leaped on a bus. He was immersed in his thoughts and did not realize that the other passengers on the bus had moved away from him, leaving a vacuum around him. He looked crazy, frightening to children who clung onto their parents' legs, and adults imagined he might be dangerous and expected his anger to explode at any moment. His eyes were open wide and glaring. He had a huge cut on his forehead which had not been taken care of. He was out of breath after running for the bus, and he stank of those ancient, moldy, and sweaty overalls he had been wearing. The ticket inspector was standing close to the driver, afraid to approach him for a ticket, worried that under that oddly loose garment he might be hiding a weapon. The mad look on his face gave people the impression that he could have been on drugs too. Chester just stared out of the window, suddenly recognizing the residential area, and, oblivious of the tangible panic around him, he jumped up and rushed through the bus, jumping through the doors as they opened. He crossed the road and without hesitating headed for what had until recently been his house. The road was deserted, and all that could be heard was the birds chirping in the trees and the wind blowing through the branches. He approached the tall gates to which were attached huge metal initials, his father-in-law's. That was what he had always hated about that house, which had been marked as that megalomaniac's property, just like everything he had ever owned. Nobody appeared to be in, not even the cleaning ladies, but the garage door was open and someone was driving his favorite sports car out. Glancing away, he was brutally stunned, his stomach cramping and his shoulders falling into a depressed stance as he caught sight of two beloved motorbikes fallen on the floor, piled up by the fountain. He felt his heart shrink at the sight of the bodywork damaged and slashed in several places. Worst of all, bits of foam and will burst through deep cuts in the saddles, clearly slashed with a kitchen knife. Perhaps his mother-in-law had taken out on those defenseless motorcycles the bloodthirsty anger that she could not satisfy by slashing open Chester's stomach. But he was hurt most by the fact that some hateful and heartless being, standing by an oil tank full to the brim, was planning to set fire to them. His mind filled with all the beautiful parts he had carefully selected and bought online, which he had not had the chance to see fitted. Chester felt disappointed, let down, and angry when he realized that someone had opened the automatic gates and was reversing out of the garage in his car. He could not see who was in the driving seat. The wonderful tinted windows he had had installed made it impossible. A moment later the car was beside him and the window was wound down. Bending down, he recognized her. "Diana, you have to explain." "Why?" But the only response that he received was her spit in his face. The car sped away, the brand-new racing wheels crushing one of his feet. As he writhed in pain, screeching like a pelican, He asked himself what on earth he could have done that was so hurtful to deserve all of this pain, made all the more bitter by seeing his two most prized possessions leave at such speed, his wife and his sports car, with its lowered suspension and the two turbo compressors so painstakingly ordered from another continent. Certain to have fractured part of his foot, he limped carefully into the garden and went to look at his bikes. He could not bear such ill treatment and wanted to take at least one of them away. He grabbed one of the silky smooth blocks of marble which decorated the fountain and used it to crash the gate's photocell, so that it could stay open.